When Wizardry, Proving Ground of the Mad Overlord, released on the Apple II back in 1981, it became a primary influence in the creation of RPGs as a genre of video games. Wizardry was one of the earliest attempts to convert the pen and paper gameplay of Dungeons & Dragons into a video game. It is generally credited with being the first party-based RPG ever made, and alongside the Ultima series, it would go on to inspire games like Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy. As a Western RPG fan, Dungeons & Dragons fan, and just a fan of weirdly ambitious games of the past, I'm ashamed to say that I'd never played Wizardry before, so I was curious if this updated version from Digital Eclipse would hold up for me in 2024. Wizardry is a first-person dungeon crawler, another subgenre of RPG that it helped create. You control a party of 6 characters that you can either custom build from scratch or recruit from randomly generated presets. You'll spend most of your time exploring and mapping a large multi-floored dungeon. Throughout the dungeon, you'll look for secrets and loot, and engage in turn-based combat via random encounters. Combat is based around the basic idea of having 3 melee fighters up front, supported by 3 magic users in the back. You can alter this formation, but it is generally a good idea to stick with this basic layout. Beyond attacking, characters can also investigate their opponent to attempt to learn more about them. Learning about your opponent can reveal their weaknesses, resistances, and additional stat information, all of which is chronicled in a bestiary. You'll want to periodically make your way back out of the dungeon and to the surrounding village to heal up and resupply. Here you'll find a shop for purchasing and selling items, an inn to heal and level up, a temple to revive downed party members, and various facilities for creating and recruiting party members. This was all represented as a text-based menu in the original game, but here you get actual buildings to select with dedicated UI elements for each one. This modern version of Wizardry has been updated in almost every way. The dungeon in which you'll spend most of your time has been rebuilt in true 3D as opposed to simple line drawings of the original version or the pseudo 3D tile sets of the later console versions. A variety of quality of life options have been added to slightly alter the way the game plays. However, I feel it is worth noting that none of these options would constitute any sort of true easy mode. You can't really make enemies weaker or make yourself invincible. Though elements have been modernized, at its core, that underlying difficulty balance has remained. And much of that is because deep down, this version of Wizardry is running on the same source code as the original. To the extent that you have the option at any point to see the game exactly as it was running alongside the modern version. I tended to leave this up in a small window off to the side, as constantly having that point of comparison was fascinating. The RPG systems themselves borrow heavily from first edition Dungeons & Dragons. This is the biggest hurdle that yet remains for modern players in understanding how to play Wizardry. Even this updated version doesn't really give you a rulebook for how things work. Even my existing experience with Dungeons & Dragons couldn't help me with everything, as core mechanics of the game were very different in that first edition from how they are now. For example, in Wizardry, like first edition Dungeons & Dragons, the lower your armor rating, the better your armor is. While pretty counterintuitive to any modern RPG, that's how Dungeons & Dragons did it up until 3rd edition, so that's how Wizardry does it. The rules aren't terribly complicated, but there are times where age has rendered them somewhat counterintuitive to a modern player. And this version doesn't offer any help in that department. Don't feel like a fraud if you need to search the internet for how these mechanics work. I certainly did. Your enjoyment of Wizardry in 2024 is going to depend a lot on the amount you're willing to put into it. I quickly became obsessed with taking a quick run into a new corner of the dungeon every night before going to bed. But a lot of that was built on an existing interest in old Western RPGs and an understanding of Dungeons & Dragons mechanics, and a willingness to look up the older rules that I didn't know off the top of my head. The game itself isn't really interested in helping you with any of that. Instead, they've made some smart adjustments to smooth out some of the aging gameplay, while still staying very true to the original. It's also worth noting that every quality of life change can be toggled on or off, so if you want this to play exactly like it did in 1981, that's an option. You can even swap to the dungeon layouts from the later console ports, if that's where your nostalgia lies or you just want to shake things up. This is an extremely faithful update of an important game, and if you're willing to give it the opportunity, you'll find it's just as addictive today as it was 40 years ago.
This video was made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Did you know that Nintendo World Report is funded directly by fans like you? When you support Nintendo World Report on Patreon, you get immediate access to multiple exclusive podcasts every month, exclusive Discord channels, an early look at select content, and more, all for as little as $1 a month. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details.